back when I disrupted that Bureau of Land Management oil and gas auction at the end of 2008, a big part of my intention was to be able to make the case that that kind of action was necessary because of the urgency of climate change and the inadequacy of our government's response to it. I was inspired by some folks in the UK called the Kingsnorth Six, who were able to make that case when they shut down a coal-fired power plant. And they were able to present what's called the necessity defense, the argument that they were acting out of necessity to prevent a greater harm from climate change. And I thought, that's exactly what we need. And so after I took my action, that's the kind of defense that I wanted to make. But I was very much shut down in being able to make that defense. I had a very ideological judge who had only become a judge because he had been the chief of staff to Senator Orrin Hatch and was appointed directly to the federal bench from Orrin Hatch's office because Hatch has so much power on the Judiciary Committee. And so he made it clear where he stood, and he said there will be no discussion of climate change whatsoever in my courtroom. And so that was part of why I got convicted and spent 2 years in prison, which gave me lots and lots of time to think about what could happen with a climate necessity defense trial, and to think about what it would look like to be able to present that full defense in a courtroom and how to make the most of that opportunity. I sat in prison for 2 years and thought about that, and then got out of prison and started organizing with more folks to try to make that happen, and found some other folks who were approaching civil disobedience in a creative and principled way when I moved out to Massachusetts, and together we formed the Climate Disobedience Center to support other activists who are engaging in civil disobedience around climate change, to try to help folks realize the full potential of civil disobedience. At the time, I felt like in the climate movement, there's been more and more of an embrace of civil disobedience to some extent, but far too much of that has been a photo op style civil disobedience, where it's arranged with the cops beforehand that if you stand in this little box that they'll give you 3 warnings, and then they'll come and they'll put handcuffs on you and they'll take you to the station. You'll be given a $100 citation, and you pay that, and you go home and you read about it in the paper the next day. That's not entirely useless, but I also think it's not realizing that full powerful potential that civil disobedience has. It's not realizing that potential that has made civil disobedience such a core part of so many of our successful social movements in our history. I felt that there was much more to be realized, not just in the action itself, but in realizing that the action doesn't end at the point when someone gets arrested, that there's a lot more opportunity to leverage that action for greater social change. When I heard about the Delta 5 activists out here in Seattle that had blockaded an oil train and wanted to take their case to trial and wanted to use the necessity defense, I jumped at the chance to get involved and to support them, and have been working with them for the past few months, and came out here this week with the other folks from the Climate Disobedience Center and sat at that courtroom in Linwood all week, and it was so incredibly moving for me. There was a point when the first defendant took the stand, and I just got choked up watching it, because I realized that this was what I had been waiting for 7 years, and what I had been working so hard to try to realize for 7 years was actually happening. That in an American courtroom, activists were presenting the full case for how serious the climate crisis is, how much our government has entirely failed to address that crisis, and how powerful people can be when they step up to their responsibility to stand in the way of the fossil fuel industry. And for 3 days, we heard tremendous testimony not only from the 5 defendants about all of their motivations and all of the things that they had tried to affect change within the system. We also heard from expert witnesses, from climate scientists, from oil safety experts, from railroad experts, from a railroad whistleblower who got fired from the BNSF for reporting safety violations. We heard all this testimony about the urgency of the climate crisis, the massive impacts that we're facing, the way that our civilization is hanging in the balance. We heard about the direct impacts that communities are facing from these bomb trains that are rolling through communities in completely unprecedented ways. Far bigger trains, far more explosive, far more dangerous. And we also heard about the money in politics that is preventing actual solutions. When Patrick was able to be on the stand and talk about the Exxon knew revelations, to talk about how Exxon knew from the 1970s about climate change, that they knew that there was a scientific consensus, and then in the 80s they started denying it and created a whole denial machine to corrupt our government. We're able to talk about how broken that governmental system is, how much corporations have an oversized influence over our democratic processes, and why just working within that system on its own is never going to be enough to address these crises that we face. This was phenomenal to see, and it was unprecedented for activists to be able to put on that kind of defense. And I think when we look at it coherently over the first few days of that trial, it was the most comprehensive and coherent case for climate activism that's ever been presented in an American courtroom. And not only that, as somebody who works full-time on climate issues and who has been focused on this for a long time, reads a lot of stuff about this, studies a lot of stuff about this, talks to a lot of people about it, I actually think it was one of the most comprehensive and coherent cases for climate action that I've seen presented anywhere. And so that on its own is a tremendous resource. It's a tremendous resource to have all of that testimony put together for future activists who are going to be taking their case to court, because we know that it's going to take more of these actions. We know there's going to be more civil disobedience against all the planned fossil fuel infrastructure projects in the Northwest and throughout the rest of the country, right? Okay. and so we have this tremendous resource for those activists. We also have it just for the general public to be able to connect these dots in the way that was done in that courtroom. That's a tremendous resource for us. And so we had this huge step forward by that point where all that testimony had been presented. And then things got a little weird. Then it got to the point in the trial where the judge had to decide what jury instructions he was going to give to the jury. And so then he heard arguments from each side about whether or not he should give jury instructions about the necessity defense. And the necessity defense has 4 requirements, 4 standards that a defendant has to meet in order to even be able to present that defense. And the first standard is that there has to be a reasonable expectation of an imminent harm. And the second point is that harm has to be greater than the harm of whatever law they're breaking at the time. The third point, they have to have not created the harm that they're trying to avoid. And the fourth point is that there have to be no reasonable legal alternatives to breaking that law. And so the judge heard arguments on each side about this, and he said, these Delta 5 defendants, they are absolutely commendable in the way that they're living their lives and in the action that they're taking. And I think they're exemplary citizens who are acting morally, and we need more of them in our society to address these harms. And there's two of them right over there, Abby Brockway and Mike LaPointe, two of the Delta 5 defendants. And then the judge said, but they're exemplary, they're moral, they're doing what's absolutely necessary, but there are these legal technicalities to which I am bound in my role as a judge and within this legal structure that I'm a part of. Oddly enough, he said this after having just heard several days of expert testimony about how our political and legal structures in this country are not adequate to address the crisis that we face. He had just heard experts talking about how these legal structures are not working. And then he said, here is what I know is moral. Here is what I know we need to avert the great harms that we are facing as a society. But the way that my legal system works over here requires me to stand in their way. So I'm going to do that. And he then denied the necessity defense, refused to give necessity defense instructions to the jury, refused to allow the defense team to present the necessity defense in their closing arguments and connect all those dots for the jury. And then the jury came back in the room and the judge said, now you need to disregard all of that expert testimony that you've heard for the last few days. It's completely inadmissible and you're not allowed to use it in making your decision. Basically, he was saying, don't think about the fact that your future is threatened, that your communities are under siege and your rights are being taken away and your democracy is broken. Don't think about any of that. He said, you have to follow these legal technicalities. Don't think about how your actions impact society. Don't think about the consequences of your actions, either for the defendants or for our world. Don't use ethics. Don't use morals. Don't use your conscience. Just look at what these legal standards say constitutes the elements of trespass and the elements of obstructing a train. And if you find that the facts in this case meet those elements, you have to convict. That is your job. So he presented this whole case that said, here's what I know is ethical. Here's what I know is legal. And I'm going to follow the laws of the system that I'm a part of. Which is something that was presented in a trial that looked at a major chapter of human history called the Nuremberg Trials. And what came out of those Nuremberg Trials is the Nuremberg Principles, which then became international law, that if you were being required in the legal system that you're a part of, if you're being required legally to do something that you know is unethical, that you know is inhumane, and puts other people at risk, you have a greater moral obligation and now a greater legal obligation through international law established by the Nuremberg Principle. You have a greater obligation to your fellow human beings than you do to that legal system. So that had been established long ago and entirely forgotten in the way that our legal system continues to operate today, and in the way that that judge operated, and in the instructions that he gave to that jury. And so, then things moved forward. The jury went to deliberate after hearing the closing arguments, came back the next morning with a little bit of an interesting verdict. They said not guilty on the charge of obstructing a train, but guilty on the charge of trespass. And that was an interesting and kind of unsuspected decision from them. It was fantastic because the prosecution was trying to make the claim that these defendants had cost BNSF $10,000 by delaying trains. But they were acquitted of obstructing a train, so it wiped that off the table. So that right there was a victory. But again, that's when things got even weirder. Because then we took a recess before the sentencing part of the case, and the jurors were dismissed. They were told that they were no longer bound in their role as a juror, and they could talk about this case, they could leave, they could go home, do whatever. But some of them didn't go home. They stuck around, and they started talking with the defendants and started saying, thank you so much for what you did. Thank you for your action, and thank you for educating us this week. Our eyes were opened to this. We learned so much, and we don't want Washington to become a fossil fuel corridor. And they said, if there was any way that we felt like we could have acquitted you, we would have. And they said, we were just looking for some way that we could have acquitted you. Which was odd, because jurors are actually the highest level of our legal system, and there's no structure whatsoever that can second guess the decision that a jury makes in this country. They hold far more power than that judge held, but they didn't know it. They didn't understand that they held that power, because the judge looks like a more powerful figure. There was this sort of latent power that they had that they didn't know that they had. And so they ended up not using it. And so then they were talking with the defendants some more, and Abby got them to agree to come to her next climate lobbying day. Two of them signed up with the Climate Disobedience Center to help us train future defendants. To help us train future defendants who are going on trial. And then three of them came back into the courtroom and sat down with the supporters to watch the sentencing part of the hearing. And so it was this amazing conclusion that was completely unexpected. It was not at all the way that any of us had planned it, but it was perhaps exactly what needed to happen in that case. And not only did it have that conclusion, but it also taught folks like me who are focused on having more of these kind of necessity defense trials, it taught me exactly what we're missing and exactly what the line is of how we can be able to do this better in the future. And yeah. And so what it came down to, as I said, was that fourth point of the necessity defense about a lack of reasonable legal alternatives. And what happened in that argument there before the court was the judge was referring to all these other ways of affecting change. And he said, that you can get attention and get your message out and do all these other things through petitions, through press releases, through, all these other means. And unless you're saying that those are all completely ineffective, then there's got to be these legal, reasonable alternatives, right? Because sure, this act of civil disobedience got a lot of attention, sure it had a big impact, which he was celebrating. He was celebrating that big impact. He would say, but certainly all these other efforts could have done that as well. And so he sort of presented civil disobedience as on the same plane and working towards the same purpose as any other kind of activism. And there was a little bit of a discussion there in the jury instruction part of the case that came down to the intent of the activists. And there was this debate between the prosecution and the judge and the defense about what the intent of the activists was. And the prosecution was saying, their intent was to block a train, and the judge was saying that their intent was to get media attention for these threats from oil trains and from climate change. And there wasn't a clearly coherent case of what their intent actually was, or what the purpose of civil disobedience actually was, that distinguishes it from so many other forms of activism. And so that got me thinking about what it is that is actually unique about civil disobedience, what it does that all other forms of activism don't do, and why it's been so important to so many social movements. And the key point that I started focusing on, that I've actually been focusing on for a while, is the vulnerability that is inherent in civil disobedience. And I think what was missing from the trial this week was an understanding that the intent of civil disobedience is not just to commit a crime. The intent is not just to get media attention. The intent is not to get word out about something. The intent of civil disobedience is to arouse the conscience of a community in order to build the kind of public pressure that is necessary to resist the corporate control of our government. And the tool through which civil disobedience works towards that intent of arousing conscience is the tool of vulnerability. Because civil disobedience is inherently breaking a crime or breaking a law, and risks oneself before the power of the criminal justice system, and it often has an element of physical risk and physical vulnerability, like Abby being at the top of a tripod in front of a train. That vulnerability rattles people out of their everyday lives. It awakens people's conscience, because I believe there's something fundamental about people, something fundamental about our human nature, in which when we see someone else in a vulnerable position, particularly someone who puts themselves in a vulnerable position, we can't completely look away. There's a part of ourselves that cannot look away from this person who is in trouble and needs help, that it is embedded into who we are as people, that we feel called to look deeply at these people who need our help. And it's that power of vulnerability that can break through the lethargic apathy that is rampant in our consumer society. It's what rattles people out of all their other concerns with their job and their bills and their TV shows that they like, and everything else that sort of numbs people to the threats and all the information about those threats that we face. And as all of us who are activists know, it's hard to get through to a lot of folks. And we can give them lots of information. We can knock on their door and try to talk to them. We can call them up and all these things. And still we have such an apathetic, disengaged society that cares more about consumerism than protecting future generations. And it's vulnerability that uniquely can break through that and can arouse people's conscience, as we saw happened this week with those jurors. That it was only because they were sort of forced to look at what was happening in this case, and they were forced to look at the vulnerability of the activists that were in front of them, that they were rattled out of their everyday apathy, and now they're going to be at Abby's next lobby day. And so I think that shows that these working within the system kind of actions are not completely detached from the civil disobedience actions that are outside the law, that they're intertwined, that they work together, that the civil disobedience arouses a conscience so that people can be more engaged in those democratic processes. And civil disobedience, unlike any of the safe legal ways of trying to raise awareness and safe legal forms of activism, with the possible exception of a hunger strike in which someone is willing to die, and in some cultures, perhaps self-immolation. Those are the only kind of legal actions that have the kind of vulnerability that civil disobedience has. So it actually does something entirely unique. And I think that speaks to that point of no reasonable legal alternatives. There are plenty of legal reasonable alternatives that can raise a little bit of awareness, that can educate some folks. There are no legal alternatives that do that work of arousing conscience, because civil disobedience is more than just an intellectual kind of activism. It's a spiritual kind of activism in which, through our vulnerability, we open up the most vulnerable parts of ourselves, which invites out that vulnerable part of others. And so what I learned this week is that even as we go through these court cases and we have to fight against all these legal technicalities, that we have to engage in that as a spiritual struggle. We have to engage in that, making this spiritual argument about what it is fundamentally about people that can be awakened, and I think that's been kind of reinforcing for me, because a big part of the reason that I chose to go to divinity school a few years ago was I realized that we have reached the limit of what we can do as a movement without soul. That in order to move forward and make progress, that we need to be a movement that is grounded in our fundamental spirituality. We need to be a movement with spirit and be willing to wade into that territory of not just the scientific facts of what we face with climate change, but the spiritual context of who we think we are as people and who we think we are as a society. And I think we got a lot closer to that this week. We got a lot of resources to be able to do that better in the future. And most of all, I think we got that demand from this week. The demand from this week, I feel like, is that in order to move forward and in order to realize our full power in this movement, we have to come into it as full people, with our full selves, including our spiritual selves. And so with that, I'll wrap it up, and I think we'll be able to have lots of time for question and answer. And I thank you all for being here.